As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me. They do not feel any enmity against me as an individual, nor I against them. They are only doing their duty. Most of them, I have no doubt, are kind-hearted, law-abiding men who would never dream of committing murder in private life. On the other hand, if one of them succeeds in blowing me to pieces, he will never sleep any the worse for it. He is serving his country, which has the power to absolve him from evil. These are the opening words of an essay called England, Your England, penned down by the English writer George Orwell in the year 1941. And the year sort of gives away who are the people trying to blow him to pieces. And the reason I wanted to begin with this quote is because it illustrates in a very powerful way a dilemma that we as Christians face when we think about nations and national identity and our belonging to various groups and communities. Because the nations to which we belong have a great impact on us. They first of all require loyalty from us. They, as an outcome of that loyalty, often or sometimes require actions that we may never dream of committing in our capacity as private citizens. And as Orwell puts it quite well, they claim the divine power to absolve us from the evil of those actions, should those actions be deemed evil according to certain standards. And of course, this poses a dilemma before us as Christians. How do we theologically square those claims with the claims and requirements of Christ? Now, you may think this all sounds overly dramatic, and it was written a long time ago, and it was written during a time of war. So I have a second quote, which is slightly more recent, and which doesn't talk about war. It talks about a time of peace, it talks about trade, it talks about jobs, it talks about prosperity, it talks about things that are close to our hearts.
We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. I will fight for you with every breath in my body, and I will never, ever let you down.
The reason why I wanted us to listen to that quote is because I think in a wonderfully clear way, it exemplifies a dilemma which stands not only before American Christians, it exemplifies a dilemma that stands before all of us. I suggest we ignore the claim that what Donald Trump is suggesting is this is a very novel thing that he's proposing to do. Because to my mind, he is saying he is going to do what is effectively expected of every national leader to do, and that is to look after the interests of his or her citizens. Nobody expects the German Chancellor, the British Prime Minister, the French or the American or the Russian presidents to look after the interests of other nations. They are there in their job to look after the interests of their own nation and promote those. But as this speech exemplifies so clearly, looking after that is an inherently selfish exercise, because nations are selfish entities by definition. Their activity is defined and driven by what is called the national interest, and that national interest is quite often in competition with the interests of other groups and people. And so, how do we as Christians participate meaningfully in the political life and in the political processes of our nations? And how do we square our participation in our nation, which is thinking about our jobs, our prosperity, our strength, our borders, and trying to exclude from that, if need be, others, and our commitment to Christ, who teaches a very different way of relating to human beings, a selfless way of laying down your life for others. It is very interesting that during the Brexit debate a couple of years ago, the arguments that were used on both sides had to do with prosperity. Do we stay in Europe or do we leave Europe? Was primarily a question of, do we want to keep control of our money, borders, and laws, or will we be richer if we stay in? Nobody was arguing, do we have a moral obligation to do one or the other? Not because this is not an important thing, but because people know that this will not win votes. People do not think in those terms when they face those decisions. And so when we think about national identity and national loyalties, this question poses before us as Christians important theological and moral and ethical dilemmas. Our world has become very small. First, as the result of colonial expansion, and then more recently because of the developments in technology. But it hasn't become paradoxically more unified. And as we have become more global, there were people back in the 19th century who thought the emergence of nations was a gradual step in the eventual unification of the whole world. There was the family, and then the clan, then the tribe, then the region, then there were the nations, and then finally the world was going to be united. And if the last 150 years have taught us anything, it is that this hope seems to have been an illusion. Because today in our global world, there is a lot of diversity, which goes along with the desire to be separate and to be independent. And with these conflicting claims, where does our loyalty lie? So these are some of the questions I would like to explore today, and I'm going to do it following the time-honored three-point method. I'll have three sections. I'll first of all look briefly at the definition of nation and what is a nation, and then I'll look at some biblical perspectives on that, and then finally I will conclude with some suggestions for practical implications. Okay, so what is a nation? That seems almost a self-evident thing, but actually there is quite a lot of debate on the definition of nation, and it is not as clear as it sounds. People, or we might be tempted to think, people argue whether there are objective factors that define a nation, or it is something subjective existing primarily in our minds. Let me begin with one quotation by Adrian Hastings in a book called The Construction of Nationhood. An ethnicity, he says, is a group of people with a shared cultural identity and spoken language. A nation is a far more self-conscious community than an ethnicity. Formed from one or more ethnicities and normally identified by a literature of its own, it possesses or claims the right to political identity and autonomy as a people, together with the control of specific territory. Now, that book is a particular local interest to us because it's actually based on the Wiles lectures delivered by Hastings at Queen's University. And he notes in the introduction to his book that one of the good things about that lecture is that for the week in which the lectures are delivered, various scholars are invited to attend, and then they discuss the lecture over dinner. And he says that as an Englishman coming to Belfast to discuss nationalism, he felt a little bit like Daniel in the lion's den. And then he says the main point of the story of Daniel was that the lions surprisingly proved quite friendly. They didn't eat him in the end. And he says the academics in Belfast were just like Daniel's lions, so they didn't eat him. They were very friendly. He survived, and he was able even to finish and publish his book afterwards. But you will see that his definition relies primarily on objective things. Cultural identity, a spoken language, political autonomy, a shared territory. And many people, especially many people who subscribe to the ideology of nationalism, think that nations are objective entities that can be defined with, in this way. However, this approach has its problems. And I don't intend really to discuss all of them, but just maybe give you one or two illustrations. First of all, ethnic identity. I don't have really a lot of time or space or desire to explore that question, but ethnicity in and of itself is a highly problematic concept. It looks like a very objective thing. It feels like that, and in my experience, when you meet people from other ethnic backgrounds, they often look different, they sound different. Whenever I go to IFS conference in Europe, usually the people from the Balkans are short, bald, and often, you know, with bellies the size of watermelons, and the Scandinavians are long and thin and blonde. You go into the room and you immediately know where people come from. So ethnicity seems to possess this objective, to have this objective feel, but if you look at the broader scope of history, you will see that ethnicity is made and unmade. Ethnic groups develop, merge into one another, and we know this to be true also at the individual level. Can you be American if your father is Kenyan? Can you be Irish if your father is from India? Can you be British if your parents are Pakistani? Ethnicity is a more complicated thing than we usually assume. Language is another obvious factor, and people who speak a certain language seem to share a common denominator, something that defines them, identifies them, and separates them from other people. But again, language is a tricky thing because well, I discovered that quite early on when in Bulgaria we used to get missionaries coming from the West, and we used to have various sort of funny incidents when someone will come and we ask him, well, where are you coming from? And he will say, I come from Glasgow. I won't attempt to do the accent because I really can't, but you know what I mean. He comes from Glasgow. So we, ignorant young Bulgarians, say, oh, Glasgow, excellent, so you're English. And then the man, you know, begins to look very agitated. And he's saying, no, I'm not English, I'm Scottish. And we say, what do you mean you're not English? You speak English, you come from Glasgow. So speaking a common language does not necessarily mean that you share the same identity. And of course, there are nations that speak more than one language. People in Belgium speak French, but they drink beer, not wine, and they don't regard themselves as French. They regard themselves as Belgian, and people to the north speak Dutch, but again, they are Belgian. So language is problematic. And because all these seemingly objective factors are inherently problematic, many people look at national identity as something which is not primarily based on objective criteria, but something which is constructed in the minds and hearts of people. Here is a quote from a very famous essay delivered by the French scholar Renan at the Sorbonne in the distant 1889. And this is how he defines a nation. A nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. Two things which, properly speaking, are really one and the same, constitute this soul. One is the past, and the other is the present. One is the possession of a common rich legacy of memories. The other is present consent, the desire to live together, the desire to continue to invest in the heritage that we have jointly received. A nation's existence is a daily plebiscite. In other words, a nation is the consent of people, and you need the renewal of that consent almost, if you like, on a daily basis. A much more recent scholar, again, one who has been very influential, is called Benedict Anderson. In his book, Imagined Communities, he defines a nation as an imagined community. And what does he mean by that? What is a community? Community, by definition, is a group of people who know each other and live in a communion with each other. By definition, therefore, a community is a fairly restricted, can be very restricted numerically. A nation is a community in which individuals do not know each other. They have probably never met each other, because it's impossible to know 60 or 80 million people, or 1 billion in some cases. And so the only way that you can participate in that community is by the power of your imagination. You think of yourself, you imagine yourself as part of this larger and bigger whole. And Anderson illustrates a number of ways in which this imagination works. For example, one of the key ones was the emergence of the printing press and the newspaper. So you're sitting here in Belfast and you're reading the Independent and what the Independent is saying about the Windrush generation and what the government is doing. And someone else is sitting in London and reading the same story, and somebody else is sitting in Coventry and reading the same story. And although you don't know each other, you, through the power of imagination, by sharing in these news and events that are far away from you, you can imagine yourself to be part of such a community. And so nations are formed not just on the basis of objective criteria. A national identity is an identity which you construct with the help of your imagination. It's a story. It's an emotionally charged story that you and other people around you tell yourselves, and which helps you to participate in that imagined community. So let me go over several important characteristics of the nation. And the first one is the nation state. Every nation either has a state or wants a state. And national identity is quite closely linked to political power, because every nation, by definition, wants to express itself politically. There were times when people were organized politically in different ways, and there were peasants and feudal lords and kings. And the way that people legitimized the power of kings and lords was because it was believed that these people had their power granted to them directly by God. In the modern world, few people, us Christians included, still subscribe to a form of that belief, but this is not the belief on which our political life operates. Power in today's society is based on the consent of the nation, the people, and therefore the nation has a decisive say in who rules and who makes the decisions. So the nation and the state are closely connected to one another. The second thing is that nations acquire quite often quasi-religious features. Nations often require loyalty which overrides all other loyalties, and it celebrates national heroes, almost like saints. And so nationalism in its more extreme forms very much looks like religious worship. Here is another quote from George Orwell, another essay penned few years after the first one, Notes on Nationalism, and this is what Orwell says. Nationalism is inseparable from the desire for power. The abiding purpose of every nationalist is to secure more power and more prestige, not for himself, but for the nation. Nationalism is power hunger tempered by self-deception. Every nationalist is capable of the most flagrant dishonesty. But he is also, since he is conscious of serving something bigger than himself, unshakably certain of being in the right. What does Orwell mean by self-deception? The desire for power and the need for self-deception go together hand in hand, and national mythology is something that plays a huge role in this. Every nation has a grand narrative of its origin that provides it with identity, with a sense of national pride, with cohesion, and that narrative is the basis of the demands that the nation places on its citizens. That narrative defines who are the national enemies, and it is disseminated through the various propaganda channels that the government has. And therefore, for us as Christians, being part of our nations, again, the dilemma emerges. What do we do when we are faced with these two narratives? The narratives provided by our nation and the narratives that the Bible gives us and the claims that come from each of those. Now, I realize that this is all a bit theoretical, and so I would like to give you a little bit of a more practical and specific illustration as to what this means, how it works, and most importantly, what are the ethical and practical consequences of this. And because we're here in Northern Ireland and because I am a Bulgarian, I have decided I will use Bulgaria as an example for two reasons. First one is because I can speak most intelligently about this, having lived through it and having this as part of who I am. And secondly, it will be for you both exotic and less threatening. Because these things can become very raw when we begin to speak about our own identity. Now I realize there are Bulgarians here, and so it might not be as exotic to everyone, but still. Okay. So an example about a few national myths and how they function. When did the Bulgarian nation start? You ask any Bulgarian, they will be able to give you a precise date, and the date is 681. So as you can see, Bulgaria, the Bulgarian nation is allegedly one of the most ancient nations in Europe. This is why we get really annoyed with all these Western nations who, and especially with the Americans who, I mean, they weren't a nation up until like a couple of centuries ago, so what do they know? Whilst we have been around for many, many, many centuries. Now, of course, in 681, the Bulgarian nation did not emerge. What happened was that a horde of horsemen came from Asia. They defeated the Byzantine Empire in a battle and established a small enclave, a kingdom in the northeastern part of the Balkan Peninsula. A nation did not emerge at that time. But still, we like to trace the beginning of that nation, and that gives us a sense of pride. And the person who made this happen was Khan Asparuh. And as you can see, the Bulgarian movie industry imagines him as a handsome young man. And the country is littered with statues of him, and he is always portrayed as a mighty warrior on a horse. Another national myth, the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, I'll let you in on a secret. You want to know how to annoy a Bulgarian, okay? This will never fail to work, okay? You want to annoy Bulgarian. I see my colleagues are now looking at me very intently. You want to annoy Bulgarian, you go to them and ask them, do you Bulgarians use the Latin or the Cyrillic alphabet? And we say, yes, of course, we use the Cyrillic alphabet. And you say, you have to kind of build on this. You say, the same as Russians, and this is when we get really, really annoyed, because actually the Russians use the alphabet the same as us because we were the first to have it and we gave it to them. in an ideal world, we would actually like there in the center of Moscow to be a huge monument with "Thank you, Bulgaria" written in gilded letters, and sort of an explicit acknowledgement, this is where we got the Cyrillic alphabet from. Okay? I think Putin is still working on this, but we'll see. And what you see on that picture is the National Library in Bulgaria, which is right at the center of Sofia, next to the university. And in front of the library is the statue of Cyril and Methodius, the Greek monks who invented the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, very few Bulgarians realize or linger over the fact that Cyril and Methodius didn't come to Bulgaria. They actually went to Moravia, which is modern-day Czech Republic. It was their disciples who came to the Bulgarian kingdom. We don't really think a lot about the fact that they were Greek monks who were commissioned by the Greek patriarch to create the alphabet for political and missionary reasons. What we do know is that their mother was of Slavic descent. Okay? And their mother was of Slavic descent, therefore they must be Bulgarian, therefore the Cyrillic alphabet is Bulgarian. And so it is a source of national pride. Okay? Now, these are, if you like, positive myths, but what I really would like to talk to you about are some of the negative myths. The darker side of national mythology. Now, Bulgaria, or what the lands that are currently part of the country of Bulgaria, used to be part of the Ottoman Empire for roughly about 500 years. This period is defined in Bulgarian historiography as the Turkish slavery. If you want to suggest to a Bulgarian that this was a time that was not a slavery, you will again get a very heated response. Very few Bulgarians actually consider the fact that we were not slaves. We were just, or the population, the Christian population of the Balkan Peninsula was just part of the Ottoman Empire, same as all other groups that were part of the empire. They had the freedom to worship for most of the time. They had the freedom to trade. Some of them were quite wealthy. Were there atrocities? Of course. Were there sometimes forced conversions? Yes. But this was not a slavery. However, in the Bulgarian mind, this is presented as a very dark period of slavery and oppression. And it has two functions. It, first of all, serves as a convenient excuse for all our failings. So you ask, why are the Bulgarians not as cultured or not as advanced or not as civilized as other nations? It's because of the Turks. We would have been ahead of the game were it not for the Turks who 500 years were trampling upon us. But the more important thing is that Turkish slavery defines for us the other, the people that we need to fear and the people that we need to hate. And these are the Turks. And I'll come back to that. And the heroes, of course, are the people who fought the Turks. These are images of two people who are probably unfamiliar to you, but you show them to any Bulgarian and you are bound to evoke a very warm reaction. The person with the beard is one of the first, if not the first, Bulgarian poet, and his claim to fame was that not that he wrote brilliant poetry, but that he organized a small band of people, he crossed the Danube, and he was shot. This is how his career ended. The other person, Vasilevsky, is the national hero, and the monument here in the center of Sofia is the monument where he was hanged. His main achievement was that he for several years circled Bulgaria and tried to organize revolutionary committees for uprising against the Turks. He was caught, he was executed, and an uprising took place few years after. It was very ineffective and it was quickly quashed by the Turks. So as you can see, in political terms, he is a real failure, but in terms of national mythology, he is a great hero. And because the Turks are the enemy, therefore, we are taught to hate them. And these are pictures from a film that was made based on a best-selling novel. In English, it's translated A Time of Violence, but in Bulgarian, it's called A Time of Decision, or A Dividing Time. And the film portrays the forced Islamization of Bulgarian people, the Bulgarian population in one of the southern mountains. It's a very well done film, it's very emotional, and I still remember watching it and some of the emotions that that violence provoked in me watching it. Now, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because I would like to talk to you about a more dark period of modern Bulgarian history. In the 1980s, the Bulgarian government decided to forcefully assimilate the Turkish minority that lived within the country of Bulgaria. There were roughly, I think, about 850,000 Turks. And in the winter of 1984-1985, December, January, the police and the army circled those regions. They were completely blocked from the outside world. Everything was shut down. Tanks were brought in those regions. And the Turkish population in those regions were forced to change their names from Turkish to Bulgarian names. And all of them, in the space of a few months, were renamed against their will. This was presented to us as the revival process, because we were told that these were really ethnic Bulgarians who had forgotten the fact that they were Bulgarians because of the Turkish slavery. And now we are freeing our nation from the last effects of the Turkish slavery. This is the last evidence of the Turkish cruelty that we need to, the injustice that we need to right. Okay. Roughly about 4 or 5 years later, there were some protests, some people were killed, and in the summer of 1989, finally, Turkey opened its border with Bulgaria and said that any Bulgarian Turk who wants to move to Turkey is free to do so. In the space of 3 months, 360,000 people moved. And some of them moved voluntarily and others were forced out. Some of them had to sell their possessions for almost nothing. And because, of course, during that time it was impossible to travel, this was presented as a new freedom for travel, and we were told these people were going on an excursion to Turkey, and so this is why this event is known as the Great Excursion. 360,000 people expelled from their homes because they do not want to assimilate. Okay. When a few years later, a law was passed to give the Bulgarian Turks the right to revert back to their Turkish names. There were protests, and even to this day, Bulgarians will get very, very angry because they feel this is unjust. So this is, I can't remember if I went to this particular protest, but I remember feeling very strongly, as many other people did at that time, that this was wrong, and we need to oppose it, because this was threatening us and it was threatening our nation. So back to our good friend George Orwell. Actions, he says, are held to be good and bad, not on their own merit, but according to who does them. And there is almost no kind of outrage. Torture, the use of hostages, forced labor, mass deportation, imprisonment without trial, forgery, assassination, the bombing of civilians, which does not change its moral color when it is committed by our side. He goes on to say, history is thought of largely in nationalist terms, And such things as the Inquisition, the tortures of the Star Chamber, the exploits of the English buccaneers, Sir Francis Drake, for instance, who was given to sinking Spanish prisoners alive, the Reign of Terror, the heroes of the Mutiny, blowing hundreds of Indians from guns, or Cromwell's soldiers slashing Irish women's faces with razors, become morally neutral or even meritorious when it is felt that they are done in the right cause. Now, I can identify with very few of the examples, if any, that Orwell does, but when I was reading those words, I thought about the Great Excursion. And I thought about my emotions, not only at that time, but even today. And I was kind of wondering why, when I'm faced with the images of two people who are suffering, a Bulgarian woman who cries because she has been beaten or raped or her husband has been killed, and a Turkish woman who cries because she has been driven from her home and deprived of everything that she possesses. Why, when I look at these images, I feel things that are so very different? Why is my emotional response different to one suffering and to the other? And the answer, I think, is very simple. I immediately know by looking at those two women that one of them is a Bulgarian woman and the other one is a Turkish woman. One is a familiar face that belongs to me, the other one is a foreign, an alien face that belongs to my enemy. And even though in my mind, I know that this is wrong, still my emotions are there. And I will never be free from them because I have been taught to love and to hate in a certain kind of way. So let me now go to my second point, which you'll be glad to know will not take as much time. But let me take a biblical look at nationalism. Okay? And when we think about the Bible, there are certain hermeneutical challenges, because nations did not exist in the biblical world. There is indeed the word nation in our Bibles, but it means something different to what it means today. There were, however, ethnic identities and identity policies, and therefore I think we can make that jump. So when you come to the Bible, it is quite easy to think that nations are part of God's creation and therefore something inherently good. And therefore for us as Christians, there is a duty to serve, to obey, and to be loyal to our nations. You have quotes like Paul's words in Acts, in Athens, that God made all nations to inhabit the whole world, He allotted them the times and the boundaries, and so on. And indeed, when you come to the Exodus, for example, you have the people of Israel and you have the people of Egypt. You seem to have two very clearly defined and distinct nations living alongside each other. God loves one nation and God hates the other nation. And when God brings in the plagues, He makes a distinction between Israel and Egypt. The flies sweep the land of Egypt, but the Israelites are immune. The livestock of the Egyptians is killed by a plague, but the livestock of Israel is not. Okay? And of course, when we read this passage, we would always be tempted to think that our nation is probably a little bit like the nation of Israel, right? God is on our side, and God is always against our enemies. However, I would like to suggest to you that there are a number of elements in the story of the Exodus and in the larger biblical narrative that subvert and question and destroy this kind of thinking. And they emerge, first of all, in the story of the Exodus. It's quite interesting that even where there is a distinct line between Israel and Egypt, the question of choice begins to emerge in the Exodus narrative. So when the Lord announces the coming of a hailstorm, the Egyptians are informed. They can make a choice what to do, whether to bring their cattle in or to leave it there. But the climax of that choice, of course, comes at the Passover. Now, the Passover is the time when the ultimate distinction between Israel and Egypt is made. And of course, the Lord sends his angel to kill the Egyptian firstborn to liberate the people of Israel from Egypt, and the people of Israel are told what to do to escape the bloodbath. But what is interesting about this story is that the Lord does not send his angel with a DNA test. It is not as if the angel is going and he's going in a household and he just checks the DNA to see whether these are true Israelites and were they descended from Jacob. The angel wants to see the sign on the door, the blood. In other words, it's not enough to be a pure blood Israelite. You need to put the sacrificial blood on the door. And so the question of choice and your belonging to Israel or Egypt by choice begins to emerge in the story of the Passover and the Exodus from Egypt already. And the book of Exodus tells us that when Israel goes out of Egypt, they go out together with a multitude of people who are not ethnically Israelite. But this story comes to a very clear expression in the next phase of the biblical narrative, and this is the book of Joshua, the conquest of the Promised Land. The conquest of the Promised Land is a military event, but the narrative of the conquest does not have enough description of battle for my liking. Okay? When I hear about battles, I like to see all the action. There is very little of that. Instead, the narrative of the conquest is taken up with the story of two people, Achan and Rahab. Rahab is the woman in chapter 2. She is a Canaanite prostitute who saves two Israelite spies who come into her house in Jericho. And because of that, she is spared from destruction and she is incorporated into the nation of Israel. Achan is an Israelite man who, when plundering Jericho, transgresses the Lord's command and hides some of the booty in his tent and brings curse and destruction on himself and the whole army of Israel. And because of that, he and his whole household are executed and cut off from Israel. Now, it is very significant that the book of Joshua presents those two stories in parallel. And if you read them carefully, you will see the many, many connections and contrasts between these two characters, both on the macro level and even at the level of individual details. So, Achan is a man and Rahab is a woman. In the ancient world, those were not equal things, okay? You realize that he was a man, therefore he mattered, and she was a woman. She didn't matter that much. Achan was an Israelite, and she was a Canaanite. Achan was the leader of a household. She was a prostitute. And so they are contrasted in every way, and their fates are completely opposite. Achan is cut off from Israel, he and his whole household. Rahab is incorporated in Israel, she and her whole household. They are even paralleled and contrasted in the mechanics of their actions. They both bring about their respective fates by hiding something. Okay? She hides two men at the top of her house. He hides the plunder underneath his tent. Okay, so you can maybe read even a bit of meaning in the direction of the hiding, if you like. And both of them are described using the phrase "to this day." So she is incorporated into Israel and she remains there to this day. And he is killed and a big pile of stones is heaped on him, and that pile is there to this day. In other words, both of them bear significance which goes beyond their individual fates. Their significance lies in the fact that they present the reader of the book of Joshua with the question, what makes one a true Israelite? Is it blood? Is it ethnicity? Is it descent? Or is it choice? And the answer of the narrative is very clear. It is choice. It is the choice to obey the Lord or to disobey him that incorporates or removes one from the people of Israel. And this arc continues. I'm not going to go through the detail of all the possible passages that you can muster, but for example, in 2 Kings 5, there is a story of a Syrian general, an Aramean, who suffers from leprosy, and a prophetic disciple, Gehazi, who was the servant of Elisha the prophet. So you have an enemy, the general who oppressed Israel, and you have what would be equivalent to an assistant pastor, a prophetic disciple in Israel. The enemy has leprosy, and he is healed, and the prophet contracts the leprosy because the enemy comes to Elisha in faith, and the disciple is deceptive and tries to con the prophet. And so here again you see the question of choice, and it is quite intriguing to observe that when Jesus is confronted by his countrymen, he chooses that story and another one of Elijah to illustrate to them that being part of the people of Israel is more a question of choice than a question of a right and descent. So both of these prophets went to foreigners. And of course, this makes his countrymen very, very angry. They want to kill him. And I think this whole arc leads us to the New Testament definition of the church, and I've chosen just a few quotes from 1 Peter, where the church, the heir of all those promises, is defined as a holy people and a royal priesthood, much like the nation of Israel, elect strangers, using the language of the Judean diaspora, aliens, foreigners, strangers who live in the world as one new people. So I would suggest to you that the Bible presents us with a story in which God works to create a community which is global, transnational, and in its New Testament expression, an immigrant community. And the trick about that community is that community demands loyalty, the loyalty that we owe to God himself, and forbids all other loyalties. So finally, some practical implications. I would like to begin here by another quote, or a couple of quotes, from that paper I quoted in the beginning by Renan, What is a Nation? He says the following: forgetting, I would say even historical error, is an essential factor in the creation of a nation. And it is for that reason that the progress of historical studies often poses a threat to nationality. Historical inquiry, in effect, throws light on the violent acts that have taken place at the origin of every political formation, even those that have been most benevolent in their consequences. Unity is always brutally established. He goes on to say, the Turkish policy of separating nationalities by religion has had the gravest consequences. It has caused the ruin of the East. Remember, he's writing at the end of the 19th century, okay? Take a city like Salonika or Smyrna. You will find there 6 or 7 communities, each with its own memories and almost nothing in common. However, the essence of a nation is that all its individual members have a great deal in common, and also that they have forgotten great many things. No French citizen knows whether he is a Burgund, and I won't even pretend I know how to pronounce all these other terms. Every French citizen has forgotten Saint Bartholomew's Day and the 13th century massacres in the Midi. Now, what I'd like to take from this quote is really this question about memory, about remembering and about forgetting. Because again, in Christian theology, the memory is an extremely important part of our worship and our relationship to God and to one another. The center of our faith is an act of remembrance. When we gather to celebrate communion, the Eucharist, we gather to remember. And it is through passing on of this memory from one generation to another that we bind ourselves in the community of faith. So, central to our worship as Christians is the choice of memory. But the New Testament talks not only about remembering, it also talks about forgetting. And here is one of the most fascinating quotes, in my view, in the whole Bible. This is in the Epistle to the Hebrews. But Jesus has now obtained a more excellent ministry, and to that degree he is the mediator of a better covenant. The days are surely coming. Here the author of Hebrews is quoting the prophecy of Jeremiah. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach one another or say to each other, know the Lord, for they shall know me from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. What I would like to focus your attention on is this final statement. I will remember their sins no more. I would like you to think about the absurdity of that statement. I mean, that statement really destroys God's divinity, right? Because how can God remain God if he ceases to remember? I'm probably treading on dangerous water here with systematic theologians in the room, but I guess I'll take the risk. Is it not by the very definition of God the fact that he is all-knowing, he knows everything, and he remembers everything? Can he stop remembering? Now, this is obviously a very silly question, because the text doesn't really want to imply this. It is a very bold image of the fact that God has forgiven our sins. He has forgiven them so completely, it is as if he has no memory of them whatsoever. But this brings, I think, this image of the divine amnesia, which stands at the center of our relationship with God. So at the center of our relationship with God, we have a memory of what he has done for us, and we have a forgetting of what we have done to him, the way that we have hurt him. And I think before us as Christians, it presents us with a very difficult and profound dilemma, which is both moral and theological. This is the dilemma of what do we choose to remember and to forget. Because every nation and every community has mechanisms of remembering and forgetting things. And I have gone through some of the national myths of the Bulgarians to show you how we remember things and what are the consequences of those memories. We remember so that we can be proud of ourselves, we know whom to fear, we know how to hate them, and we know how to deal with them whenever we get the power to do that. And every nation, every community, every group has those mechanisms of memory and forgetfulness. And I think for us as Christians, the theological challenge is this. What are the things that we choose to remember, and what are the things that we choose to forget? There are realistically going to be things that we as individuals will never, ever forget. Preparing for this lecture, I realized something very uncomfortable and frightening and disquieting. And this is, I realized I'm a nationalist and I will die a Bulgarian nationalist. I hate this about myself, and there is nothing I can do about it. I'm wired that way. And even though I know that it's wrong in my mind, to fear or to hate for things that happened to my great-grandparents back in the 19th century when they were rising against the Turks and when they were fighting for their freedom, I still feel that because this is how I was brought up. But I realized that as a Christian, I have a choice. And my choice is, what will my children remember? Will I pass on to them that hatred and that hurt? What is the memory that I choose to pass on to them? Now, you realize I have been talking in parables, right? Yes. Because this is a choice that we all face. We all have our hurts, we all have our flags and our parades, and we all have our burdens to bear. But what we remember and what we forget is a choice which is profoundly ethical and profoundly theological. So may the Lord help us in all this. Amen. Well, I suppose what I would say is my view of nationalism is defined by the belief, therefore, that we owe our primary allegiance to God as part of that people of God that we belong to. And this undermines our loyalty to our nations. Having said this, however, I wouldn't say that we should withdraw from public life. On the contrary, I think we should be involved in public life because we are part of this world, because God has called us to live in that world, and because I believe God is the Lord of all creation, and therefore everything that happens is part of His creation and His plans, and we have a mandate and a calling to do this. So I think the fact that our primary loyalty does not belong to our nations does not mean that we should not try to support them, does not mean that we should not try and be good citizens, does not mean that we should not get involved in the political process, but it means that when it comes to the national interest and we have to decide, do we uphold the interest of our nation at the expense of other people, causing damage to other people because it suits us, this is where I think we have a real choice between God and nation. So I don't think the two work together very well at times. Yeah, I think that's precisely the question. And religion quite often functions within the framework of nationalism by even providing nations with a reason for existence. So religion quite often is the dividing line between ethnic groups that are quite similar. Serbs and Croats are a good example, Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. And so religion quite often functions in that way, and therefore it is married to the national cause. So going back to my Bulgarian example, Bulgarians believe that the Eastern Orthodox Church is an extremely important institution because the claim is it has preserved the Bulgarian nation throughout the Turkish slavery. Now, the historical fact is probably slightly different. The Bulgarian nation emerged much later on, so there was nothing to preserve. But the connection between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Bulgarian nation is very, very strong in the popular mind. But this is true of a lot of other religions. I think Protestantism in other countries is quite often linked to the national cause. I'm not an expert on, let's say, American politics, but it seems to me quite evident sometimes when I listen to some American Christians that to be a Republican and to be a Christian and to be American are more or less the same thing. And so religion is used to justify nationalism, and therefore when you do things for your nation at the expense of other people, this is okay. because the two are so closely linked together. So that connection soothes the consciousness and removes the force of the dilemma. And I think probably part of our job is actually to try and force people to see that there is a dilemma quite often, and there is a contradiction between our national goals and our religious commitments. Well, I'm keenly aware it has a parallel here. That's why I really included it in the talk. And I think it is very important. The reason why I quoted George Orwell's essays a number of times is because they're fairly brief and obviously they're quite dated. But they have helped me with one very important aspect of this topic, which I hadn't realized up until the time I read those essays. He has another one on anti-Semitism, which I didn't quote, but he explores their anti-Semitism and he explores the emotional, irrational side of it. And reading that, I realized that these nationalistic feelings have a reason which is probably to do with way that you are brought up, experiences that you have, beliefs and convictions that you hold, that are rationally, you can rationalize and see them as wrong, but they still have a power and a grip on you. I think for me the important thing has been, first of all, to realize that they're wrong. Secondly, to realize that they still have an emotional impact on me. Thirdly, to become realistic in my expectations of dealing with that emotional impact, and to realize that maybe I cannot fully eradicate those feelings. And then finally to say that whenever I have a contradiction within me, just as it is with every other sin, I have a choice to make, and it is really what defines and determines that choice that matters, not so much the conflict within me prior to the choice. So I suppose, like Luther, I say, sin boldly, in that I recognize my own sinfulness and the fact that I cannot always deal with it completely, but it is really the question of the choice that comes afterwards that I think is important. First of all, I need to say I'm not an expert on the Middle East, so what I think probably doesn't have a lot of value. I don't mind sharing it with you. I've lived in Syria for a while. As a teenager, my dad was working in Homs and then in Hama. I wasn't a Christian at that time. I was fairly young, so that experience doesn't really give me a lot of clout when I talk about Syria, but it is, for me, quite an emotional thing, because I have very clear memories of that place, and seeing those people and what is happening is quite painful. I mean, President Assad has been portrayed as this great monster, and I think he probably is. You only need to see some of the atrocities that take place. But it is true that he is a secular ruler who comes from a minority within Syria, and because he comes from a religious minority, his policy and the policy of his father before him has been to hold this state with various ethnic groups on the basis of an overarching national identity, which does not privilege one group against the other. So I do suspect that his rule would be more beneficial for Christians than the alternative, which is preferred by the West. So yeah, I would say probably you're right, but I mean I say this with a pinch of salt because I'm not an expert. I think this is where it's very interesting how we respond to the propaganda in our own media, because our governments have their own agenda, which is not necessarily connected to any Christian objectives or aims or values or the interests of Christians there. But we quite often can buy into that agenda without thinking too much, because we are told. I remember when when the States invaded Iraq, there were friends, I have friends from England who are passionately arguing what a good choice this is because Saddam Hussein is such a monster and he has to be stopped, all the horrible things he does. Whether the alternative is better?
Well, if there's no more questions, I would like to say a big thank you to Charlie. It's been stimulating, and I think there's things that we can think about, and I think there are things that we should be challenged about for the next while. Before we leave, could we pray together? O Lord God of the nations, we come to again say to you that you are our Lord, that our desire is to follow you, and yet we are conflicted. We have been told stories, we have believed stories, we've been brought up with stories that have become part of us. Give us the grace to be aware, and give us hearts and eyes that are compassionate to the other. And so help us to walk and to follow you closely. For we ask this in Jesus' name.